189. That's the precise, infuriating number of industrial-grade, gleaming, hideously incongruous solar panels my homeowners association, under the iron-fisted, diamond-encrusted, utterly deluded leadership of its president, Brenda McLaughlin, unilaterally decided to install squarely on my private property. Yes, you heard me correctly. On my land, for which I pay the mortgage, the taxes, and for which I hold a very clear, very unambiguous deed. Drop a comment right now and let me know where you're watching from. Because this story isn't just a little neighborhood spat. It's a saga of entitlement, overreach, and a quiet, leafy revenge that even I, a retired landscape architect, with a lifetime of coaxing life from the earth, hadn't fully anticipated. You'll want to tell me if your HOA has ever dared to pull a stunt even half as audacious as this. How did I get here, you ask? How did I find myself one sunny Tuesday morning, staring at what looked less like a suburban backyard, and more like an alien energy farm had crash-landed, and was beginning to devour my meticulously planned perennial beds? It's a tale that starts, as these things often do, not with a bang, but with a passive-aggressive, vaguely worded newsletter and the chilling smile of a woman who believed she was queen of all she surveyed. And apparently, all I surveyed too. It all began about 3 years ago, when my wife, Clara, and I decided to purchase our forever home in the Lakeside Harmony Estates. The name itself should have been a warning, perhaps. Harmony is often a euphemism for rigid conformity in places like these. But we were charmed by the mature trees in the common areas, the proximity to a rather lovely, though mostly inaccessible, we'd later discover, lake, and, most importantly, Lot 72, our lot. It was at the far end of a cul-de-sac, bordered on one side by a dense tract of undeveloped common land owned by the HOA, a buffer of sorts, promising privacy. The yard was spacious, a blank canvas for me, with a gentle southern exposure that had me dreaming of terraced gardens and perhaps a small, personal orchard. I'm Arthur Davies, by the way, though most folks call me Art, and for 60-odd years, designing and nurturing landscapes has been my life's work and passion. I envisioned a sanctuary, a place where native plants could thrive, where birds would flock, a little slice of ecological balance in an increasingly unbalanced world. Little did I know I was about to engage in what could only be described as horticultural warfare against a suburban despot. Our first few months were deceptively peaceful. We painted the trim a tasteful sage green, a shade I'd carefully selected to complement the existing stonework. We received our first HOA-friendly reminder letter within a week. Sage green was not on the approved palette of 3 shades of beige and one particularly offensive peach. That was our introduction to Brenda McLaughlin. Brenda was a vision, always impeccably, if somewhat ostentatiously, turned out. Her blonde hair was sculpted into a helmet of such rigid perfection, it likely had its own structural engineer. Her daily attire consisted of power suits in colors that seemed to scream, "Look at me, I'm important," usually accessorized with chunky gold jewelry that clanked with every imperious gesture. She drove a colossal, pearl-white Cadillac Escalade, always showroom clean, which she navigated through the narrow community streets with the focused aggression of a tank commander. Her expression was perpetually one of someone smelling something vaguely unpleasant, especially when interacting with residents who dared to possess an opinion, or worse, a non-regulation mailbox. The initial infractions she pursued were minor, textbook HOA pettiness, the precise angle at which our recycling bin was placed on collection day, the unapproved variety of geraniums in a planter by the front door, apparently only patriotic red was acceptable in summer, the supposed infraction of our grass being a 1/4 inch over the mandated height in one particularly dry spell. Each came with a thinly veiled threat couched in saccharine language. I was already feeling the tendrils of frustration, the sense of being watched, judged. Then came the newsletter. Tucked between an announcement for the annual mandatory Fun Day picnic, Brenda's photo, beaming proprietorially, featured prominently, and a stern warning about pet etiquette, was a small paragraph. It mentioned Lakeside Harmony's commitment to a greener future, an exciting community energy independence project, and the board's decision to explore sustainable power solutions. It was all couched in feel, good buzzwords, utterly devoid of specifics. No mention of what these solutions were, where they'd be located, who would be paying, or, crucially, any sort of community consultation or vote. A tiny alarm bell, no louder than a gnat's burp, went off in my head. I'm all for green initiatives, genuinely. My entire career has been about sustainable design. But something about Brenda's clandestine approach felt off. I pulled out our hefty binder of HOA documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CCRs, that unholy Bible of suburban serfdom. I read it cover to cover, paying particular attention to sections on common areas, capital improvements, and homeowners' rights. There were clauses about the board's authority to maintain common elements, but significant capital expenditures usually required a homeowner vote, or at least extensive notification and consultation. This energy independence project sounded suspiciously like a significant capital expenditure. A few weeks later, the gnat's burp became a buzzing hornet. I was pruning my prize-winning roses, a variety definitely not on Brenda's approved list, a quiet act of rebellion, when I saw them, two men in fluorescent vests, tromping through the HOA common land that bordered my property. They were carrying tripods and what looked like surveying equipment. I wandered over casually. "Morning," I said. "Big plans for the common area?" One of them, a sun-weathered man with a weary expression, grunted. "Oh, project. Putting in some, infrastructure." He was deliberately vague. I pressed a little. Infrastructure? Like what? A new playground, perhaps? Or maybe some nice native plantings? I'd be happy to offer some suggestions. He just shook his head, exchanged a glance with his partner, and mumbled something about just doing the survey as per the map. The map. That word would come back to haunt me. The real shock came the following Monday. I was out running errands. Clara called me, her voice tight with disbelief. "Art, you need to come home, now. There are trucks, big trucks, and they're on our lawn." I broke several minor traffic laws getting back. And there it was. The horror. Two flatbed trucks were parked partially on the street, partially on my meticulously edged grass. A small bulldozer was already making muddy tracks across my side yard, the one leading to that unused buffer of HOA land, and horrifyingly, across a significant portion of what was unequivocally my backyard. Men were unloading stacks of steel frames, and what looked like, no, it couldn't be, solar panels, dozens of them, piled up like an invading army's shields. I parked haphazardly and sprinted, or as close to a sprint as a man of my years can manage, towards the foreman, a burly fellow in a hard hat, gesticulating wildly at his crew. "What in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice probably a few octaves higher than usual. "This is private property. This is my land." He turned, an expression of mild annoyance on his face. "Oh, job, buddy. Solar array. Got the work order right here." He waved a clipboard vaguely in my direction. "Says this whole section here." He pointed, his dirty glove tracing an arc that encompassed a huge swath of my property. Land I'd already mentally dedicated to a wildflower meadow and a quiet contemplative bench. "This is an outrage." I sputtered. "No one informed me. No one asked for my permission. You are trespassing." He shrugged, the universal gesture of the minion absolving himself of all responsibility. "Talk to your HOA. We're just the installers." Got a deadline. And with that, he turned back to his crew, who, taking their cue from him, resumed their destructive ballet of unloading and staking out. The initial staking, I noticed with a surge of cold fury, extended at least 50 feet into my property, parallel to the HOA common land, creating a massive rectangle of violation. And that's when I saw her, Brenda McLaughlin, emerging from her Escalade, which she'd parked with imperial disdain right across the entrance to my driveway, blocking Clara's car. She glided towards me, a thin, satisfied smile playing on her lips, her gold bracelets clinking. "Ah, Mr. Davies," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I see you've met the harbingers of our new green revolution. Isn't it exciting?" "Exciting?" I felt like I was about to have an aneurysm. "Brenda," I said, striving for a calm I absolutely did not feel, "your men are on my property. They are about to install a commercial solar farm on my land. Without my consent, this has to stop. Now." She tilted her head, her helmet of hair unmoving. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Arthur. It's for the good of the community. Think of the energy savings, the positive environmental impact. You should be thrilled to be contributing so significantly." Then came the kicker, delivered with a condescending pat on my arm that I had to resist the urge to recoil from. "Besides, that part of your land was just sitting there, wasn't it? All wild and unproductive. We're improving it for you. And," she added, with a wave of her hand as if bestowing a great gift, "we have a community easement. It's all perfectly legitimate." An easement? I knew my deed, my survey. There was no such easement. This was a bald-faced lie. A land grab, pure and simple, orchestrated by a woman whose ego was apparently now generating its own gravitational pull. She then produced a flimsy photocopied site plan, hastily drawn, it looked like, on a napkin by a child, with a thick marker line scrawled across a crude representation of my lot. "See?" she said triumphantly, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at the offending line. "Progress, Arthur. You can't stop progress." Her eyes glinted with a mixture of malice and an unshakable belief in her own infallibility. She genuinely thought she held all the cards, that I was just another mildly annoying gnat to be swatted away. Little did she know, she wasn't just dealing with Arthur Davies, retired homeowner. She was dealing with Art Davies, a man who understood the language of the land far better than she ever could, and who was about to dig in deeper than any survey stake she could imagine. The battle lines, quite literally, had been drawn on my own damn lawn. The sheer audacity of Brenda McLaughlin and her solar panel invasion left me reeling, but only for a moment. Anger, cold and sharp, quickly replaced the initial shock. This wasn't just an encroachment. It was a declaration of war on my property rights, on my peace, on the very sanctuary Clara and I had sought. Brenda's smug assertion of an easement and her dismissive wave towards that ludicrous site plan were insults to intelligence. I knew, with the certainty of a man who has read countless surveys and property deeds over a lifetime, that no such general community easement for sticking a commercial power plant on my land existed. As a landscape architect, I dealt with my fair share of zoning laws, boundary disputes, and easement interpretations. While my expertise lay more in ecological design than in property law, the fundamentals were ingrained. My first, most crucial step was to retrieve my official property survey. I had it filed meticulously, of course, along with the deed and title insurance documents. Spreading it out on the dining room table, Clara peering anxiously over my shoulder, I traced the boundary lines with my finger. Crystal clear. The meets and bounds description was precise, irrefutable. The area where Brenda's bulldozers were currently churning up my future wildflower meadow was unequivocally 100% mine. There were standard utility easements noted along the front of the property for power lines and water mains, as is common. But nothing, absolutely nothing, granted the HOA the right to build a small power station in my backyard. Armed with this certainty, I began my methodical counteroffensive. The next morning, I was at the county recorder's office. I requested copies of all HOA incorporation documents, the master plan for Lakeside Harmony Estates, and any recorded easements or amendments pertaining to the development. David Chen, a young software engineer from down the street, happened to be there researching some historical zoning for a home project of his own. He was a quiet, whip-smart guy who'd already had a few minor run-ins with Brenda over the precise shade of his welcome mat. When he overheard my request and saw the grim set of my jaw, he raised an eyebrow. "Solar panel dispute?" he guessed. I nodded. "She's annexing my backyard." A flicker of something, amusement, solidarity, crossed his face. "Brenda McLaughlin is a force of nature," he said dryly. Or perhaps a natural disaster. Let me know if I can help with the digital deep dive. Sometimes things turn up online that don't make it into the official files, if you catch my drift. I thanked him, making a mental note. He could be a useful ally. The documents I procured from the county confirmed my survey. No grand, sweeping HOA easement over private lots for community projects. In fact, the original master plan showed the common area bordering my property specifically designated as a natural buffer zone intended to remain undeveloped. Brenda wasn't just trespassing. She was violating the foundational blueprint of the community she purported to lead. My next step was to attempt reason with the HOA board. I drafted a polite but firm letter, attaching copies of my survey and the relevant sections of the master plan, respectfully requesting an immediate cessation of construction on my property and a meeting to discuss the misunderstanding. I sent it via registered mail, return receipt requested. The response was underwhelming. A curt email from the HOA secretary, a nervous woman named Doris who always looked like she was on the verge of tears, stating that the board had full confidence in President McLaughlin's management of the Community Energy Independence Project, and that they considered the matter addressed by the existing community easements. It was clear Brenda had them thoroughly cowed or completely snowed. Doris had clearly just typed what Brenda had dictated. Enablers. Every petty tyrant needs them. My attempt to speak at the next scheduled HOA monthly meeting was an exercise in futility. Brenda, gavel in hand, eyes flashing like warning beacons, cut me off repeatedly, declaring my points out of order or not relevant to the approved agenda. When I tried to distribute copies of my survey, she actually had the equally bullish vice president, a crony of hers, named Big Stan Kowalski, who fancied himself HOA security, physically block me. Big Stan, whose neck was wider than his intellectual curiosity, puffed out his chest and muttered something about disrupting the harmony of ignorance perhaps. It was during this farcical meeting that Brenda, with a triumphant smirk, announced, "And I'm pleased to report that Phase 1 of our solar array, our community's jewel of green energy, is almost complete. We're already looking forward to the significant savings on our clubhouse electricity bill, thanks in no small part to the, shall we say, ideally situated land that facilitates it." The implication was clear. She thought she'd won. The panels were going up fast, a silver blight spreading across my land with chilling speed. The hum of generators and the clang of metal became the unwelcome soundtrack to our days. Clara was beside herself, but she was also my rock. "Don't let her grind you down, Art," she'd say, her hand gripping mine tightly. "You know what's right." It was time to talk to the neighbors more systematically. Many were sympathetic behind closed doors but terrified of Brenda's retribution. Stories emerged of punitive fines for trivial violations, of public shaming in HOA meetings, of Brenda using her position to settle personal scores. However, I did find a few more solid allies. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet elderly lady in her 80s, had lived in Lakeside Harmony since it was first developed. Her mind was sharp as a tack. "Oh, that Brenda," she said, shaking her head, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Always overreaching. I remember when your lot, dear, was specifically marketed for its privacy and its connection to that undeveloped buffer. Old man Hemlock, the original developer, he'd be spinning in his grave if he saw what she's doing." She even remembered conversations about ensuring that buffer remained wild. Her testimony, if it ever came to that, could be invaluable in establishing original intent. David Chen, my acquaintance from the recorder's office, proved to be a godsend. He was a digital native, a veritable wizard at unearthing obscure information. He started discreetly looking into the solar company Brenda had contracted, their previous projects, and any financial incentives tied to the Lakeside Harmony installation. "There's always a money trail, Art," he'd said, a glint in his eye, or at least a trail of inflated ego. Throughout this, I documented everything. I took hundreds of photographs, date and time-stamped, showing the daily encroachment, the exact placement of each panel foundation on my land. I shot video footage of the construction crews working on my property, often with Brenda herself on site, directing them like a field marshal. I kept a meticulous log of every communication, every ignored letter, every dismissive comment. I even invested in a couple of discreet, motion-activated security cameras covering that part of my yard, just in case. Then, I engaged a lawyer. Not to immediately sue, but to send a much stronger cease and desist letter than my own. My friend, Tom Allen, a semi-retired attorney with a delightfully cynical view of HOAs, drafted a masterpiece. It laid out, in no uncertain terms, the trespass, the lack of legal basis for the HOA's actions, the clear violation of my property rights, and demanded the immediate removal of all equipment and personnel, plus remediation of the damage. We sent it to Brenda and each board member individually. Brenda's response, relayed verbally through a visibly shaken Doris who'd been sent as a reluctant emissary, was pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Tell Mr. Davies," Doris stammered, refusing to make eye contact, "that President McLaughlin received his communication. She says the project is proceeding as planned for the benefit of the entire community and that he should, and I quote, stop being such a NIMBY and embrace the future." She also said, Doris gulped, that lawyers don't scare her, they just enrich her HOA's legal counsel fund. The gall. By this point, the full complement of 189 panels, yes, I counted every single one of those damn things, was installed on my property. They sat there, an ugly, shimmering testament to Brenda's hubris, transforming what should have been my pastoral escape into an industrial zone. They cast long, intrusive shadows in the morning, their faint electronic hum, a constant irritant, and they completely obliterated the view of the wooded common land beyond. Worse, they were already impacting the microclimate of my remaining yard, changing sun exposure patterns for the plants I'd painstakingly started to cultivate near the property line before the invasion. David Chen, meanwhile, had started digging into the financials. He discovered something interesting. The state offered substantial rebates for community solar projects, but there were tiers. To hit the maximum rebate tier, a certain total panel wattage or square footage of array was required. The common land adjacent to my property, while sizable, was apparently just shy of the area needed for that top-tier rebate, if the panels were installed with proper setbacks and maintenance access. By spilling onto my unused 50-foot strip, they'd gained enough contiguous space to qualify for the significantly larger financial windfall. "I bet you $1, Art," David said, showing me the figures on his laptop, "that Brenda sold this to the board based on those maximum rebate projections. And I bet you another $1 the details of where that extra land was coming from were glossed over. This wasn't just about green energy anymore, if it ever truly was. It was about money, and it was about Brenda looking like a hero for securing it. And she had used my land, my rights, as collateral without a second thought. Her casual cruelty, her absolute conviction that she could simply take what wasn't hers, that she was above reproach, fueled a new kind of resolve in me. Direct legal battles would be long, expensive, and exhausting. Brenda seemed to relish public conflict, as long as she controlled the narrative. I needed a different approach, a quieter one, something she wouldn't see coming until it was too late. And as I stared out at those soulless, gleaming panels, an idea began to germinate, an idea rooted in my deepest expertise, my very soul as a landscape architect. If I couldn't move the mountains of steel and silicon, perhaps I could move the earth, and what grew from it, to make them utterly, delightfully, useless. The weight of those 189 illegally sited solar panels pressed down on me, not just as a visual blight, but as a constant, humming reminder of Brenda McLaughlin's audacious theft of my land and peace. My lawyer, Tom, confirmed what I suspected. An immediate injunction to force removal would be a costly, drawn-out court battle. Brenda and her compliant board would undoubtedly use HOA funds, my funds, our neighbors' funds, to fight tooth and nail, burying us in legal motions and delays. She'd paint me as the villain, the curmudgeon obstructing progress and community benefit. It was a public fight she would relish, played out in her arena. I needed to change the battlefield. I needed to fight on my terms, using my own unique arsenal. I'm a man of the earth, a student of growth and form. For decades, I've shaped landscapes, coaxed life from barren soil, understood the intricate dance of light and shadow, and it was this understanding that sparked the solution. It came to me one late afternoon, as I sat on my patio, observing how the setting sun glinted off the panels, each one a smug, metallic eye staring back at me. Solar panels, for all their technological marvel, have a fundamental dependency: sunlight. Abundant, direct, unimpeded sunlight. What if, I mused, that sunlight were to become impeded? What if I couldn't remove Brenda's illegal alien invaders, but I could effectively neutralize them, silently and slowly, using the very laws of nature she so casually disregarded? The idea blossomed with the force of a spring thaw. I wouldn't just plant a few bushes, I would raise an army. An army of trees, my specialty after all. This was where my professional skills as a landscape architect would truly shine. The first step was meticulous research, not just into botany, but into local ordinances. I spent days at the town hall poring over zoning codes, tree ordinances, property line setback rules for vegetation. What I found was beautiful in its simplicity. There were no height restrictions for trees planted on private residential property. As long as the tree trunks themselves didn't encroach on neighboring land, and their roots didn't damage public utilities or foundations. Branches overhanging a property line could technically be trimmed back to the property line by the owner of the adjoining property, but critically, this applied to branches overhanging another private property or directly impeding public right-of-way. The solar panels were on my land. The trees would be on my land. Any shade they cast upon those panels would be an internal affair, so to speak, within the confines of my own lot. The HOA's common land was adjacent, yes, but my strategic planting would target the panels on my territory first and foremost. And even if some branches eventually extended over the HOA common land, the HOA's recourse was limited to trimming those specific branches at their expense. They couldn't demand I cut down trees solely on my property just because they didn't like the shade falling where Brenda had illegally built. The concept was delicious in its quiet legality. My next phase was design, and this, I confess, brought a grim sort of professional joy. I dusted off my old drafting tools and even fired up some landscape design software I still had. I wasn't just going to plant a hedge. I was going to engineer a wall of shade, precisely calculated to block the maximum amount of sunlight from reaching those 189 unwelcome guests. I took precise measurements of the solar array's footprint on my land. I inputted sunpath data for our latitude, tracking the angles of sunlight across all seasons, from the low winter sun to the high summer arc. My goal was to create a dense, year-round screen that would eventually render those panels inefficient, then useless. The choice of soldiers for my leafy army was critical. I needed a mix: some fast-growing pioneers to establish shade quickly, and some longer-lived, robust native species for permanent effect and ecological benefit. For the front lines, I selected a cultivar of Thuja green giant, known for its rapid growth, up to 3 to 5 feet a year in good conditions, and its dense, feathery foliage that creates an almost impenetrable screen. They were the shock troops. Behind them, and interspersed, I planned for slower-growing but ultimately taller and broader native hardwoods. Several species of oak, perhaps a few maples known for their dense canopies, and some American hornbeams, which are wonderfully tolerant of some shade themselves as they grow. I even considered some fast-growing, broad-leafed evergreens like southern magnolias for certain spots, their large leaves perfect for eclipse duty. Each tree was selected not just for its shading potential, but also for its resilience, its suitability to our local climate and soil, and, in a touch of personal satisfaction, its benefit to local wildlife. My arboreal army wouldn't just be a tool of revenge, it would be a living, breathing ecosystem. The planting itself was a quiet operation, conducted over several weekends. I hired a local nursery to deliver the young trees, dozens of them, ranging from sturdy saplings to more established specimens that would give me a bit of a head start. David Chen, bless his supportive heart, came over under the guise of helping an old guy with some yard work. And together, along with Clara, who provided encouragement and iced tea, we dug, planted, mulched, and watered. It looked, to any casual observer, like an ambitious landscaping project, nothing more. Brenda McLaughlin drove past several times in her gleaming Escalade during those planting days. I saw her slow down once, her lips pursed in that familiar disdainful sneer. She probably thought I was finally tidying up that wild and unproductive part of my yard she'd so generously decided to improve. She might have even smirked at the relatively small size of the saplings. Then, little suspecting their future mission, I could almost hear her thinking, bless his heart, trying to make it pretty around our magnificent solar farm. The irony was a warm blanket on a cold day. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly ally, toddled over one afternoon with a small basket of freshly baked cookies and a knowing twinkle in her eye. "Doing a bit of planting, Arthur?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over the lines of young trees. I just smiled. "Just adding a little more green to the neighborhood, Mrs. Henderson. Good for the soul." She patted my arm. "Trees are patient, dear, and they grow. Remember that." Her words were a quiet encouragement. I meticulously documented this phase as well. I kept all receipts for the trees, soil amendments, and mulch. I took photos of the planting process, noting dates and specific locations for each tree, creating a living blueprint of my leafy barricade. If any tree ordinance issues were ever to arise, which I doubted given my research, I would have irrefutable evidence of when and how they were planted, entirely within my rights. There were no permits required for planting trees of this size on private residential land in our town, another beautiful loophole in Brenda's overzealous rulebook. She was so focused on enforcing her often invented bylaws about paint colors and lawn ornaments that she'd completely overlooked the far more powerful and perfectly legal tools available to a homeowner defending their own turf. As the last tree went into the ground, a young but promising oak that I envisioned one day towering over the entire ridiculous solar array, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the explosive victory of a courtroom battle, but something quieter, more organic. I had sown the seeds of my revenge, quite literally. Now, all I had to do was nurture my green army, wait, and watch Brenda's multi-million-dollar community asset slowly starve in the shade. The sun, which she had sought to harness so imperiously on my land, would, through the agency of my trees, become her project's undoing. The first few months after the planting, life in Lakeside Harmony Estates returned to a tense sort of normalcy, at least on the surface. My landscaping project was noted, perhaps with a few raised eyebrows from neighbors who knew of my ongoing dispute with Brenda, but mostly it was dismissed as Art Davies puttering in his significantly reduced yard. Brenda herself seemed to regard my efforts with a sort of smug indifference, occasionally making comments at HOA meetings about the beautification efforts some residents were undertaking near the marvelous new solar farm, as if I were somehow adding aesthetic value to her illegal installation. Little did she realize that every inch those saplings grew was a small victory, a silent encroachment on her stolen sunlight. Time, as Mrs. Henderson sagely reminded me, is a tree's greatest ally, and as a landscape architect, I knew that patience and consistent care yield remarkable results. The first year, my leafy soldiers were still relatively unassuming. The Thuja green giants, true to their reputation, put on a noticeable spurt, growing from waist-high whips to nearly shoulder height. The oaks and maples, more deliberate in their youth, focused on establishing strong root systems, but even they showed promising new growth. I watered them diligently during dry spells, mulched them carefully to retain moisture and suppress weeds, and talked to them like old friends, a habit I've never quite managed to break. Clara would often find me out there at dusk, examining a new leaf bud or gently training a branch, a quiet smile on my face. "Tending to your troops, General?" she'd tease. And I was. Each tree was a sentinel, a future pillar in my wall of green. The first subtle signs that my strategy was working began to appear in the second spring and summer. The nearest row of Brenda's prized panels, the ones closest to my newly planted tree line, started to experience dappled shade for longer periods in the mornings and late afternoons. It wasn't a total blackout yet, but the efficiency of those particular panels, I imagined, must have been taking a hit. I pictured Brenda and her board poring over confusing energy output reports, scratching their heads. They probably blamed cloud cover, dust, faulty inverters, anything but the unassuming line of greenery steadily asserting its presence on my property line. I'd see the HOA's designated maintenance crew, a couple of bored-looking guys in a rickety pickup truck, occasionally swabbing down the panels with long-handled brushes. Their efforts, I knew, would become increasingly futile. By the third year, the transformation was undeniable. The thuja green giants were now well over 10 feet tall, thick and verdant, forming a nearly solid wall of green. The young oaks and maples were catching up, their canopies broadening, their leaves casting increasingly dense shadows. The closest 2 or 3 rows of the 189 solar panels on my land were now spending significant portions of their productive daylight hours in partial or full shade. The carefully calculated angles of my planting design were proving effective. Sunlight that should have been energizing Brenda's folly was instead fueling the growth of my beautiful, defiant trees. The first official rumbling from the HOA came not as a direct accusation, but as a panicked general notice in the monthly newsletter. It spoke of unexpected underperformance of the solar array and urged residents to be extra vigilant about conserving energy to offset the temporary shortfall. There was even a mention of bringing in specialized technicians from the solar installation company to diagnose the mysterious issues. I almost choked on my coffee reading that. Mysterious issues, indeed. Brenda McLaughlin, I knew, would not remain mystified for long. Her arrogance was matched only by her terrier-like tenacity when her pet projects were threatened. The day of reckoning arrived on a bright Saturday morning. I was enjoying a cup of tea on my patio, admiring how the light filtered through the leaves of my burgeoning tree line, creating a cool shaded oasis where previously the sun had blazed down on sterile glass and metal. Brenda's white Escalade screeched to a halt at the curb, and she emerged, looking like a wasp whose nest had just been violently poked. She marched, not glided this time, directly to the edge of my property, her face a mask of thunderous indignation. Big Stan Kowalski, her ever-present shadow, lumbered behind her, looking vaguely confused but ready to enforce whatever pronouncement was forthcoming. "Davies!" she bellowed, dispensing with any pretense of civility. You're overgrown bushes. They are deliberately interfering with vital community assets. This is sabotage." I took a slow sip of my tea before rising and walking calmly to meet her at the de facto border my trees now formed. "Good morning, Brenda Stan," I said, my voice even. "Firstly, these are trees, not bushes. Secondly, they are on my property. And thirdly, I happen to think they're rather beautiful. They're excellent for carbon sequestration, provide habitat for birds, and frankly, they significantly improve my view, which was rather spoiled by certain recent additions." I gestured vaguely towards the shaded panels. Brenda's face went from crimson to a rather alarming shade of puce. "You did this on purpose," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You planted these weeds to block our solar panels. You are costing this community money. You will cut them down. You will cut them down today." "Now, Brenda," I said, still calm, "I don't recall any HOA bylaw that dictates the specific location or height of trees planted entirely on one's own private property, especially when those trees are well maintained and pose no hazard to anyone else's property. These trees, you see, are improving my property. The fact that they also happen to provide shade, which, as you know, is a natural consequence of trees growing, is just a fortunate byproduct." Stan stepped forward, puffing out his chest. She said, "Cut 'em down, Davies. Means you cut 'em down." I looked at Stan, then back at Brenda. Are you threatening me, Stan? Are you suggesting you intend to come onto my private property to damage my trees? Because that would be trespassing and destruction of property, and I assure you, I would involve the authorities immediately. I even have some excellent footage from my security cameras of our previous encounters and the ongoing situation. I let that sink in. Stan looked uncertainly at Brenda, who seemed momentarily taken aback by the mention of cameras, but her fury quickly resurfaced. This is an outrage, an attack on the community, she spluttered. There are rules about landscaping that obstructs common elements. Indeed there are, I agreed pleasantly, but these trees are obstructing elements on my land. Elements, I might add, that were placed there without my permission. A rather crucial distinction. Wouldn't you agree? The confrontation ended with Brenda storming off, vowing to bring the full force of the HOA down on me. The official notices started arriving a few days later. First, a friendly reminder to trim shrubbery that may be impeding common infrastructure. Then, a formal notice of violation, citing a vaguely worded bylaw about maintaining landscaping in a neat and orderly condition that does not detract from community aesthetics or interfere with HOA assets. It demanded immediate and significant pruning of the offending trees. My lawyer, Tom, helped me draft polite, factual responses, pointing out that the trees were healthy, meticulously maintained, entirely on my property, and that the HOA assets they were supposedly interfering with were, in fact, illegally situated on my land. We quoted chapter and verse from the CC, rupees, regarding property rights, and noted the distinct lack of any covenant preventing a homeowner from allowing trees on their own land to cast shade on other items, also on their own land. The situation was becoming darkly comedic. Brenda then tried to get the HOA's landscaping contractor, a company run by a cousin of Big Stan's, to come onto my property and remedy the tree situation. I was home when their truck pulled up. I met them at the property line, calmly informed them they were about to trespass, pointed to my clearly visible no trespassing signs, and mentioned that the entire interaction was being recorded. The two landscapers exchanged uneasy glances and, after a muttered phone call, presumably to Stan or Brenda, sheepishly retreated. Legal letters flew back and forth like angry paper airplanes. The HOA's lawyer, a slick character named Lionel Finch, whose fees were undoubtedly enriching Brenda's legal fund, sent increasingly threatening missives. Tom Allen, my attorney, countered each one with cool logic and unassailable facts. The core issue, Tom kept reminding Finch, wasn't my trees. It was the HOA's solar panels illegally occupying my client's property. The trees were a symptom, not the disease. Meanwhile, my arboreal army continued its silent, relentless advance. More rows of panels were now succumbing to shade. The total energy output from the 189 panels on my land, I imagined, must have plummeted to a mere trickle of its design capacity. David Chen, who had access to some publicly available, if obscurely published, energy generation data for such community projects, confirmed my suspicions. Their overall figures are tanking, Art, he told me, a grin spreading across his face. There's a section in their report that notes significant localized underperformance in Sector Gamma. I'm pretty sure Sector Gamma is your backyard. The wider community was definitely noticing the absurdity now. Whispers turned into quiet chuckles. Some neighbors, emboldened by my defiance, started subtly complimenting my beautiful new privacy screen. Support for my cause was growing, though many were still hesitant to voice it openly for fear of Brenda's wrath. David, ever the tech-savvy strategist, started an anonymous online community forum thread innocuously titled, Discussing Lakeside Harmony Energy Efficiencies. It quickly became a coded space for residents to share observations about the shady dealings and growth of problems with the solar project. Brenda was becoming a laughingstock, and her green revolution was looking more like an expensive, embarrassing farce. The pressure was mounting on her, and I knew she was a cornered animal. That's when they are most dangerous. I braced myself for her next move, certain it would be a desperate one. The final showdown was clearly imminent. The breaking point arrived, as these things often do, not with a sudden explosion but with the relentless accumulation of pressure. The diminishing returns from Brenda's prize solar array were becoming impossible to ignore. Whispers at HOA meetings turned into pointed questions. The significant savings she had promised were conspicuously absent from the budget reports. In fact, murmurs began to circulate that the HOA was actually losing money on the project, especially when factoring in the maintenance costs for underperforming panels and Lionel Finch's mounting legal bills for threatening me about my perfectly legal trees. Brenda McLaughlin, queen of Lakeside Harmony, was starting to look less like a visionary leader and more like an incompetent spendthrift with an expensive, sun-starved albatross around her neck. Rumors also began to circulate, subtly fanned by David Chen's discreet online probings, that the hefty state rebates might be in jeopardy if the system couldn't demonstrate its promised efficiency within a certain time frame. Brenda, feeling her carefully constructed empire of arrogance crumbling, did what all desperate tyrants do. She decided to double down. An emergency HOA meeting was called. The stated purpose, printed in bold capital letters on the notice slipped under everyone's door, was to discuss urgent matters pertaining to the continued viability and protection of community assets, and to authorize necessary actions. Translated from Brenda speak, it meant, I'm going to railroad through a vote to spend a fortune suing Art Davies into oblivion, or maybe pass some ridiculously retroactive bylaw about solar obstruction that Finch assures me will totally stick, despite Art's lawyer laughing in his face. I knew this was it. This was the showdown I had been preparing for, the culmination of 3 years of quiet defiance and meticulous planning. I was ready. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a room usually reserved for potlucks and Brenda's self-congratulatory award ceremonies. She'd invented several community service awards, most of which she awarded to herself or Big Stan. Tonight, however, the air was thick with tension. More residents than usual had turned out, drawn by the scent of impending drama. Clara was by my side, her hand giving mine a reassuring squeeze. Mrs. Henderson gave me a brave little wave from her seat near the front, and David Chen offered a subtle nod of solidarity. Brenda, resplendent in a screaming pink power suit that did nothing to soften her increasingly haggard expression, opened the meeting with a 15-minute diatribe. She painted me as a nefarious saboteur, a selfish individual deliberately undermining the community's noble efforts towards a greener future. She spoke of my hostile vegetation, my uncooperative attitude, and the significant financial damage my actions were inflicting upon every single homeowner. She dramatically presented Lionel Finch's expert legal opinion that I was in clear violation of at least 3 newly interpreted, or perhaps freshly fabricated, CC/R clauses regarding interference with common property, conveniently ignoring, of course, that the common property in question was sitting illegally on my private land. Her voice rose to a near shriek as she demanded the board authorize an immediate lawsuit to compel me to remove the offending arboreal obstructions and to seek punitive damages for my malicious campaign against co-blood.